Shalom and welcome back for episode 3 of season 2. We are traveling right along, so let's get right into this one. This is a fairly short episode, so I might try to squeeze everything into one video on this one. This episode is based on one verse of scripture from Matthew chapter 4, verse 24. I'm going to read it to you from the NIV version. News about him spread all over Syria, and people brought to him all who were ill with various diseases, those suffering severe pain, the demon-possessed, those having seizures, and the paralyzed, and he healed them. If you remember Jesus' discussion with Philip around the fire in the last episode, they said they were on the way to Syria, so that's what we're going to see in this episode. This episode is primarily from the point of view from the disciples. We are actually not going to see Jesus until the very, very end of this episode. I want you to pay attention to the discussion that the disciples are having amongst themselves. How are they feeling about following Jesus? What is their understanding of what they thought the Messiah would be versus what they actually got with Jesus? Mother Mary is going to join the group for a little while. We're going to meet back up with her. She's going to have a very personal discussion between her and the followers. I want you to pay attention to how she felt when Jesus was first born, and how is she feeling now that he is an adult and has started his ministry. The disciples are going to discuss their likes and dislikes about being Jewish, all of the laws, oral, written laws, everything that they have to follow. Watch what is happening amongst them as Jesus returns, and pay attention to how the episode ends. That's what to watch for. Now, I know that you all love my nerd notes, but since this episode is so short and it's mostly just discussion between the disciples, I honestly have no nerd notes for this episode. Sorry, guys. I'll get more nerd notes for you the rest of the season, though. So I hope you enjoy episode 3 of season 2. I'll get right back to you with our post-show discussion and Bible reference guide. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed episode 3. Let's get into our post-show discussion and then get into our Bible references. There was a great conversation between little James and Thomas about why little James has not been healed, and was it difficult for little James to sit there and watch all the healings knowing that he hasn't been healed yet? This is a little bit of a setup for a future episode that happens in season 3, so we'll really get into it then. But a few questions I have for you is, have you ever felt the way little James has? Why do some get healed or receive a blessing in life, but others do not? Philip helps Matthew understand that learning and holiness don't make you more precious to God. God is already with you everywhere, even in the mundane or difficult moments. Philip notes that no amount of learning can bring you closer to God. So my question for you is, do you ever find yourself relying on knowledge, relying on works, or relying on feelings to try to feel closer to God? How do you balance the pursuit of knowledge with simple faith in God's constant presence in your life? Now, the Jewish people of that time wanted and were looking for someone like King David or like Judah the Maccabee, which is the Hanukkah story. They wanted an earthly king to overthrow their oppressors, to overthrow Rome. This is why many Jews, even to this day, will deny that Jesus was the Messiah or the fact that Jesus was Jewish. The prophet Zechariah, specifically in the book of Zechariah, chapter 14, verse 3, is where the concept of a military leader comes from. Now, there was a minority concept of a suffering Messiah that would precede the Messiah that would rule back in those days. Those Jews thought of possibly either two Messiahs or one Messiah with two comings. The first coming would be as the sacrificial lamb, and the second coming as the ruling lion. If you really want to take a deep dive into that information comes from the Dead Sea Scrolls, so please go look up some information on the Dead Sea Scrolls. The disciples themselves spend a significant amount of time around the campfire debating the Messiah's role, with many still expecting a military leader to overthrow Rome. They struggle to reconcile this with Jesus' focus on healing and teaching, not overthrowing the oppressors. Question for you: how often do our personal expectations and interpretations of Scripture blind us to what Jesus is actually doing in our lives or in the world? Matthew is dealing with his own feelings and about the choices that he made working for Rome. He feels guilty about not knowing the Scriptures as well as the others, although in reality he probably would have been slightly more aware of the customs and the prayers than what is portrayed in the show. Dallas Jenkins, the creator of The Chosen, has admitted that Matthew would have known more in reality, but he explains the way that he's portrayed in the show as a way to showcase some of the Jewish laws, customs, and traditions for the audience. Now, the Jewish views on tax collectors, they viewed tax collectors as the lowest of the low. To the Jewish people, tax collectors were worse than the Romans because it was a choice. Romans were born Roman, they didn't have a choice. Tax collectors chose to work for Rome. In a court of law, their testimony would not be accepted. They were considered to be ruthless and vile. Tax collectors would often raise more tax than what was actually owed, so they could skim money off the top to put in their own pockets. Tax collectors were, in a sense, putting a greater burden on the Jewish people than what Rome already was. Being an informant to Rome was also considered to be just as bad as being a tax collector. This is why you see tensions flare between Simon Peter and Matthew. Simon expresses that he can't forgive, he won't forgive Matthew for being a tax collector and a traitor to his people. This conflict among the chosen people highlights their own ongoing sin and need for grace. Jesus arrives at the end of this argument, stunning them into silence with his weary presence. And as you notice, the end credits roll with just crickets. No theme song, no music, just crickets. What kind of conflicts do we see in our own faith communities that mirror the disciples' inability to get along? How does Jesus' presence resolve or reframe those arguments? That's it for our post-show discussion. Next, I will get into all the Bible verses that were referenced in this episode. So once again, this episode was based off of Matthew chapter 4, verse 24, and you can even throw in verse 25 if you'd like. The scripture that Philip gives to Matthew is from Psalm 139. He specifically gives him verse 8. I would invite you to read verses 7 through 10. I have them posted on my wall at work. The prophecy of Zechariah that Thomas is quoting comes from Zechariah chapter 14, verses 2 through 4. And Big James quoting a poem. Now, this is not found in the Bible. This is found from something called the Psalms of Solomon. And depending on the translation, it depends on the verse number, but it comes from the Psalms of Solomon, chapter 17. And like I said, either verse 32 or verse 36, depending on the translation. So that's all for episode 3 of season 2. Next up will be the halfway point, episode 4. If there's anything that we talked about today that you have more questions about, please leave me a comment. If there's anything that you watched that we didn't discuss and you'd like to discuss, please leave a comment. Also, please like and subscribe so you can get informed whenever I drop the newest episode, the newest video. I appreciate your time, and God bless you.